Words are but the signs of ideas. That's Samuel Johnson, a good reminder, isn't it? Language isn't just noise, it's history, it's knowledge, identity, all packed together over centuries, millennia even. And today, we're going to do a deep dive into something really fascinating and honestly, often debated, the ancient history of India's languages. You've probably seen the headlines, maybe stuff on social media, claims flying around about which language is, the oldest. It gets tangled up in politics, identity, all that. But what does the actual rigorous research tell us? What have archaeologists, historical linguists, even paleobotanists uncovered about these really deep linguistic roots on the subcontinent?
That's exactly what we're diving into. Our mission here is to get past those simplified, sometimes pretty politically charged claims. We want to explore the complex, often surprising story that the evidence actually reveals about India's linguistic heritage. We're drawing on a whole range of studies, particularly as they were summed up in a recent piece in the print. The goal is really to give you a clear, evidence-based picture of this intricate history, help you cut through the noise and, be genuinely well-informed.
Okay, let's unpack that. When we talk about something like Dravidian languages,
Mm-hmm.
that term itself can sometimes feel a bit loaded. But in research, it's used in a very specific linguistic way, right? Just as a language family.
Absolutely. Think of Dravidian here purely scientifically. It's a classification. It groups languages sharing a common ancestor, like how Indo-European links English, Hindi, Russian, all those. And the speakers or communities historically tied to this family, they're incredibly widespread. The sources really highlight this. Not just the southern peninsula, but stretching deep into central India.
Right, and then you have those real outliers, like the Brahui language way over in Balochistan and Kakistan. That alone tells you the historical footprint was much, much bigger than maybe people assume.
It really does. And it's not just about currently spoken languages. Historical linguists, scholars like Thomas Troutman mentioned in the sources, they've found evidence of what's called a Dravidian substrate.
A substrate meaning like an older layer of language?
Exactly. An older linguistic influence on languages that came later in a region. Troutman found this kind of evidence in place names in Maharashtra. He also points out certain cultural practices, specific types of cousin marriage, for example. These are shared between groups in places like Sindh, even Gujarat. It strongly hints at older connections, migrations, things that happened before the linguistic shifts we see later.
Wow. So, with such a widespread family, how do researchers even start figuring out where it all began or what the original speakers were like? Sounds like some serious linguistic detective work.
It definitely is detective work. Painstaking stuff. Historical linguists use reconstruction. By comparing the oldest shared bits, common words, similar grammar, sound patterns that keep showing up across all the modern Dravidian languages, they build a kind of hypothetical model of that single ancestor language.
Yes.
That's what they call Proto-Dravidian. We don't have, inscriptions of it, but it's scientifically pieced back together.
Okay, Proto-Dravidian. And what can this reconstructed language tell us about the people, their world back then?
This is where it gets really interesting. The vocabulary is like a window. For instance, solid reconstruction work, like Franklin Southworth's study on Proto-Dravidian agriculture back in 2005, it found they likely had a shared word for king. That suggests some kind of social hierarchy. They also had similar words for hut and village. That points to small, probably related communities, right? Not big cities.
Small settlements, maybe some social structure. What about how they lived day to day, their economy?
Well, the vocabulary shows they knew about farming tools, hunting tools. They had names for different wild animals, and crucially, the words for crops. They point to specific plants being known around the 3rd millennium BCE, things like sorghum, millet, gram. Plus, they had words for cattle pens, domesticated sheep, goats.
So, farmers and herders. And what about the environment? Does the language, maybe combined with other clues, tell us where they lived?
Yeah, combine the linguistic clues with findings from archaeobotany that's studying ancient plant remains found at dig sites. Researchers like Dorian Fuller suggest they lived in a dry, deciduous forest kind of environment. The crops, the animals they had words for, it fits that picture.
Okay, now for the big step. Matching the language theory with what's actually found in the ground. Can we line up this reconstructed Proto-Dravidian world with archaeological finds?
Yes, and this is where it gets really specific. It aligns surprisingly well in one particular region and time frame. Researchers basically look for archaeological cultures that ticked the boxes from the linguistic reconstruction. So, small settlements, evidence of those specific animals, those particular crops, in that kind of dry forest setting. And that pattern strongly matches finds from what archaeologists call the Southern Neolithic period in India.
The Southern Neolithic. Okay, and where is this region, the one with the strong match?
This is a key takeaway from the research, and yeah, it might surprise you. It's a region that sort of sits at the crossroads of where the major modern Dravidian language branches meet, which suggests it could be a central point, where the languages later spread out from. When you compare Southworth's reconstructed Proto-Dravidian words with the actual plant remains found at Southern Neolithic sites there's a remarkable 73% match. That's huge. And the really significant thing is, this region is pretty far from the places usually linked with modern South Indian linguistic pride, like Deep South Karnataka or Tamil Nadu. Based on all this combined evidence, the core area for the radiation of these Proto-Dravidian speakers seems to be the Krishna-Godavari Valley. That's in present-day North Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh.
Wow. North Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh.
Yeah.
Not the Deep South. That really does challenge some common ideas. But hang on, does that mean that specific valley is the absolute ultimate origin point for everyone who ever spoke any Dravidian language?
Good question. Not necessarily. And the research is careful here. The Krishna-Godavari Valley looks like a crucial hub from which the language is diversified and spread later, maybe around that 3rd millennium BCE mark. But Proto-Dravidian itself, the reconstructed language, it shows signs of borrowing words from other language families that were around even earlier. The sources mention loanwords from Austroasiatic languages. That family includes languages over in Southeast Asia, and also the Munda languages spoken by tribal groups in parts of Odisha, Chhattisgarh today.
So even before this Proto-Dravidian stage in the Krishna-Godavari Valley, there was already interaction and migration.
Exactly. It suggests that maybe speakers of even earlier forms of Dravidian migrated into that valley. They would have met other groups, other languages, picked up words along the way. The sources do mention sort of tantalizingly potential older links, maybe to the Iranian plateau, maybe connections to the Harappan civilization, but they flag those as, fascinating ideas for another day, needing more solid evidence right now.
Okay, so it's already a mix and match story, even before we get to the identifiable Proto-Dravidian in that valley. What happens when the language evidence doesn't quite line up with the archaeology? What do those mismatches tell us?
That's actually super revealing. It helps us understand the limits and the complexities. For instance, those Southern Neolithic people in the Krishna-Godavari region, they practiced urn burials. They buried their dead in big pots. But there's no reconstructed word for urn burial in Proto-Dravidian.
That's weird if they were the exact same people, right? What about the Harappan civilization? That was around the same time, roughly. Any strong language link there?
Again, not a perfect fit, which is significant. The source points out, look, the Harappans built these incredibly advanced cities. They must have had tons of words for engineering, geometry, administration, all that stuff. But those kinds of sophisticated urban terms, they're pretty much missing from the reconstructed Proto-Dravidian vocabulary we have. Another example, the rhinoceros. It shows up all over Harappan seals, a common symbol. But there's no Proto-Dravidian word for rhinoceros.
Okay, so Harappan culture. Complex cities, specific symbols. Proto-Dravidian. Vocabulary focused on farming, villages. What's the interpretation?
It doesn't mean no Dravidian speakers were in the Harappan zone. That civilization was huge, almost certainly multilingual. But it strongly suggests that the main Proto-Dravidian language system we can reconstruct from later languages wasn't, the language of the big Harappan cities. Maybe there were Dravidian speakers there, but speaking a different, perhaps now lost early branch, one that evolved separately from the Krishna-Godavari group. Now, Proto-Dravidian does have words for crops like wheat, which might have come from the Harappan region, so that points to definite interaction, agricultural exchange, even if the core city languages or cultures were different. Where Dravidian speakers were before this radiation in the south, well, that's still one of the big open questions.
It really underlines how you could have connection and separate development happening at the same time. So, okay, we have these Proto-Dravidian speakers linked to the Southern Neolithic around 3000 BCE in that Krishna-Godavari area. What happens next? How does the story unfold?
Well, the sources point to a major shift around 1100 BCE. Seems like there was a big population boom among these groups. And this wasn't just more people in one spot. It looks like it triggered significant waves of expansion, people spreading out across the subcontinent, probably driven by, needing more resources, finding new opportunities.
And their lifestyle changed as they moved and grew?
Yes. Initially, as Dr. Suresh Kumar Muthukumaran notes in the material, their basic farming was mostly dry farming, relying on rainfall for millets, pulses, tubers, so this suited that drier environment. But think about supporting a rapidly growing, spreading population. Eventually, that scale demanded more intensive methods. So a much greater reliance on irrigated farming developed for crops like rice, and cash crops like cotton, sugarcane. The big shift really picked up steam later, towards the end of the first millennium BCE. And this whole process, spreading out, adapting, it wasn't in isolation. Over centuries, these expanding groups were trading words, animals, crops. Not just within India, but even connecting with places like Southeast Asia. It shows really old interregional links.
Right. And this expansion, this interaction, that must be how we get the different branches we see today, especially the South Dravidian languages.
Exactly. One major branch of these expanding populations headed south. Some groups ended up relatively isolated, maybe in unique environments like the Nilgiri Hills. Think of the Irula and Toda people. Their languages took distinct paths. Others settled in the more fertile plains and coastal areas. And these groups, well, they spoke the ancestor languages that would eventually become Kannada, Tamil, Malayalam.
Ah, okay, this brings us right back to that early point. The claims about one language directly coming from another, specifically the Tamil versus Kannada debate. The sources tackle this directly.
They do, and they clarify it using the linguistic evidence. According to top linguists like Krishna-Godavari, the language line that leads to Tamil seems to have branched off from the common ancestor fairly early, maybe around 600 BCE, which, interestingly, is roughly when the first big cities were growing up in the Gangetic Plains up north. Then, over the next few hundred years, by about 300 BCE, it developed into what we call Old Tamil. And that's historically huge, because Old Tamil, thriving in those early South Indian trading towns, it's the first Dravidian language where we have definite proof of a really sophisticated written culture, literature, grammar, the works.
Got it. And Malayalam, where does that fit?
Malayalam comes much later. It branched off from regional dialects of what was then Middle Tamil, probably sometime between, say, 800 and 1200 CE.
Okay, so back to Canada. Was it, like some claims suggest, born directly out of Tamil?
The research, citing Krishnamurti specifically, is pretty clear on this. No, the ancestor language of Canada was not Tamil. It was its own distinct, now lost, South Dravidian language. Now, this ancestor language was related to both the languages up in the Nilgiri Hills and to Old Tamil, meaning they all shared a common ancestor way back, but Canada didn't split off from Tamil. Think of them more like cousins, not parent and child.
That's a really crucial distinction, based purely on the linguistic family tree.
It absolutely is. Now, we don't have Kannada writing that's as old as the old Tamil inscriptions. The earliest confirmed Kannada writing is dated to around 450 CE, so its very earliest steps aren't quite as visible. But once written Kannada appears, we see it develop through stages, and its dialects, especially up in North Karnataka. They've had a lot of back and forth, a lot of influence from Indo-Aryan languages like Marathi. And remember, Marathi itself picked up an older Dravidian substrate earlier on.
So it's never neat, separate trees. It's this complex web, constant borrowing, influence going both ways across different language families.
Precisely. The sources really hammer this home, this pattern, this incredible mosaic built from borrowing, evolution, migration, languages shifting. It's not just a Dravidian story, it's the story of all Indian languages. And frankly, it's how human languages worked everywhere, always.
Can you give us an example from the Indo-Aryan side, just to show the same process at work?
Sure. Take Rigvedic Sanskrit, one of the earliest Indo-Aryan languages we have records of. By the time it was taking shape, maybe around 1500 BCE, the early Indo-Aryan languages moving into the subcontinent, they'd already soaked up a significant amount of vocabulary from languages that are now lost. Professor Michael Witzel's work, which the source mentions, shows borrowings from extinct Austroasiatic languages in Punjab, possibly from some language of the Harappan civilization in Sindh, sometimes called Meluhan, and even from a language spoken by Neolithic farmers in the Gangetic Plains, which he dubs Language X.
Wow, so even the earliest recorded Indo-Aryan wasn't pure. It was already a mix from day one, influenced by what was already there.
Exactly. Never a clean import. And the mixing just continued. Fast forward a few centuries, maybe around 800 BCE, and what do you see? Dravidian words start popping up in the Rig Veda itself. This could be evidence of interaction with North Dravidian languages, ones that might have existed outside that main southern family we talked about, and are now lost.
And this wasn't just a one-way street. It flowed back and forth, different times, different places.
Absolutely. We mentioned Old Tamil literature developing around 300 BCE, but here's a twist. Linguists generally agree the words Sangam, used for those famous Tamil literary gatherings. It was probably borrowed from Indo-Aryan. And those early Tamil poets, they clearly knew about Vedic myths, they referenced them. Around the same time, up in North India, you get the rise of the Prakrit languages. These were descendants of early Indo-Aryan, used for religion, literature, sometimes more widely than Sanskrit itself. Krishnamurti suggests these Prakrits likely developed partly through absorbing speakers of now-lost regional Dravidian languages into the North Indian mix, shaping the local Indo-Aryan forms.
So whether it's Marathi borrowing from Canada, both having older layers underneath, or Tamil borrowing from Indo-Aryan and vice versa, or Prakrits being shaped by Dravidian speakers, it's just layer upon layer, this incredible intertwining over thousands of years.
It really is. And the exchange stayed strong. Jump ahead to the medieval period, from about 600 CE onwards. All of the major Southern Dravidian languages, Tamil, Canada, included, they borrowed heavily from classical Sanskrit,
Yeah.
the later standardized form, especially for words related to politics, grammar, religion.
Okay, so let's pull this all together. Given this incredibly detailed evidence-based picture, what does it tell us about those questions we started with? Which language is oldest? Which is most native?
It tells us those questions themselves are kind of flawed. They're based on a misunderstanding of how language history actually works. The story isn't a simple race or a linear progression. It's not a competition for nativeness. It's this complex, dynamic, multi-layered mosaic built over thousands of years. Constant borrowing, evolution, migration, mutual influence between totally different language families.
No language in India's deep past really existed in isolation.
Not at all. Every single language family, every language within them, they've all branched off from earlier origins, which were often already diverse themselves. And pretty much every language has borrowed words from others or lent words to others across the centuries. This research just makes it crystal clear the amazing linguistic diversity you see in India today. It's a result of this mind-boggling mixing of people, words, technologies, ideas across huge spans of time and geography.
Understanding this is so valuable, especially if you're trying to get a really deep grasp of India's history and culture. Maybe for something like the UPSC exams, where that kind of nuanced understanding is critical for mains and preems, or really for anyone who just wants to be properly informed.
Exactly. When you appreciate this intricate, evidence-based history, you really see the true depth and complexity of India's heritage. Those simplistic claims we sometimes hear, the political sound bites. This language is older, this one's purer. This kind of research just shows how superficial they are. There's a powerful line, an insight from the source article. It says, such patriotic oversimplifications actually end up trampling on the histories and dignities they claim to protect.
That quote really hits home, yeah. Simplifying this deep shared history, it actually makes it smaller, diminishes it. So knowing all this now, about these incredibly deep, tangled roots, even about languages that left traces but then vanished. What does that make you think about how we perceive, say, modern regional identity or cultural identity through the lens of language today?
It definitely makes you pause and think about identity now, doesn't it? Given this past of nonstop interaction and mixing. And it also sparks curiosity, I think. How much more is there still buried, waiting to be discovered about those lost languages? The ones that were spoken, that contributed something, but whose full stories we can only guess at now from the echoes they left behind.
Absolutely. Well, this deep dive has certainly shown that the real story of Indian languages is way richer, way more complex, and much more interconnected than those simple narratives suggest. We've gone through reconstructing Proto-Dravidian, looked at its surprising potential heartland, unpacked those fascinating mismatches that show just how tricky the past is, and trace that ongoing web of interaction with Indo-Aryan and other language groups over millennia.
It's really a testament to what happens when different fields work together, isn't it? Linguistics, archaeology, paleobotany, fields you might not immediately connect. They come together to reveal this incredibly dynamic, shared heritage.
We really tailored this deep dive to help you get your head around these complex ideas quickly, get past the surface noise, whether you're prepping for exams or just fascinated by India's amazing past. If you found this useful and you want more deep dives like this to help you stay informed on important topics, please do hit like and subscribe to the show.
Yeah, and please, if you have questions or just thoughts sparked by our chat today, drop a comment below. We genuinely love to hear from you and keep the discussion going.
And just a reminder, all the information we explored today was drawn from the findings presented in excerpts from that article in the print, which brought together research from numerous experts.
Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into the ancient history of India's languages.
We look forward to the next one.